first and ask for Charlie and Owen to comment, or anyone else to comment. So I'm recording this. I think the recording has already started. So first of all, just staying with the red giants first, and then going back to the massive stars. Maria Lugaro suggests that if you are to incorporate all these different processes that break symmetry, don't you need multidimensional models? So how feasible would that be? Charlie, do you have something to say about that, or anyone
Yeah,
else?
actually, yeah, I can begin. Actually, it's a very difficult and complex multidimensional problem. But the problem is that we need to do stellar evolution. So we need to have simple prescriptions. So even if we go toward a very high complexity in the transport processes and all this stuff, we need at one time to get the physics behind that and propose prescriptions that can be put into a stellar evolution codes very easily. So yes, we need this kind of complex studies, but we also need to have some analytical developments or simple prescriptions to mimic the more complex reality. This is my opinion, actually.
Yeah, so also basically going to the massive stars then, to what extent would we need multidimensional models for those? Because one of the things we're trying to do in this field is look at similarities in physics, but that might manifest themselves a little bit different in depending on the mass and the previous evolutionary history maybe. But among massive stars, of course, you're also dealing with rotation, possibly magnetic fields, etc. So does anyone have something to say about what might work in perhaps high mass stars that we can learn from for low mass stars and vice versa, given that we can do astroseismology on the lower mass stars, but by my knowledge, not yet on the red supergiants. Anyone can unmute themselves. At the moment, we're not having a risk that people will start talking through each other. So feel free.
Jaco, Joel as a there and up.
So there are a couple other things coming through the Slack. So early on, Simon Campbell just reacted to this. So the high mass red supergiants are too large for astroseismology. Is that the case, or what's the main limitation for applying astroseismological techniques to the more massive red supergiants? I don't know if Charlie has an idea about that.
Yes, I think when you go to more massive stars, actually, I'm not sure, but I know that all the mixed mode detectable for low mass stars, actually, you can observe mixed modes from a certain position in the H-Spring-Russell diagram, because after that, the red additive diffusion is so strong that the modes are really strongly damped. So you cannot see modes propagating very well inside mixed mode, inside the more evolved stars like AGB stars. For more massive stars, I think it's a new class also of pulsators. These are not anymore solar-like pulsators, and you can have some different excitation mechanism or damping mechanism, and this is more difficult to predict the spectrum. But I think you still, I'm not very used about this question, used about more massive stars, but I think this is possible. You can see some modes, but they are quite different of what I just presented you.
Yeah, so Simon follows that up. we may be able to use some of the available diagnostics, but maybe not all, but it might still say something interesting. Also, perhaps, Owen, maybe you can comment on whether you might be able to apply things that we learn about fundamental processes, such as convective boundaries, from, say, studies of the lower mass stars. And then if we understand better the physics and how we should describe that mathematically, then perhaps we can use it to our advantage also in the models for those stars that we cannot directly probe the oscillations. Is that something that's feasible, or would one model not fit all, essentially? Are we back to fudge parameters such as the mixing length? Anyone want to comment after Owen?
Yeah, I have just one comment to make about that. That if we're looking at sort of convective boundary mixing during the main sequence, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that the parameter for overshooting that we have in the models changes as a function of mass, and so it's likely that there's some relatively strong mass dependence there that maybe we could have some kind of handle on at the lower mass end, and we could extrapolate, but we wouldn't know for sure.
Yeah, I was just going to talk a little bit about astroseismology for more massive stars. I know Dominique Bowman has been doing a lot for more of the hotter stars, but also Trevor Dorn-Wallenstein at the University of Washington recently did a bunch of test astroseismology of yellow supergiants and some red supergiants. And the limiting factor right now is kind of just that there aren't that many of them. And so having data for that, you know, having test data on red supergiants, there's just not that much to get. And so right now the limiting factor really is kind of data. And so I think with time, we'll be able to learn more, but I'll put more into the Slack chat about what some people have been doing with astroseismology of red supergiants, but there's a little bit out there, but I think there is still some interesting stuff to learn. It's just, we're kind of data limited at this point.
Yeah, it's great that you also refer to similar sort of features for blue evolution that Marcelo also said, we should not forget Savids, for instance. All these things together can tell us something, perhaps not in their own right, but when we put them all together, as Marcelo said. But yeah, Catherine, you're doing great work in looking also at the yellow supergiants and blue supergiants. Your hand is still up. Did you want to come back in on that?
Oh, sorry, I'll put it down.
Oh, that's fine. So Joel Ong, you put something in the chat earlier, in the Slack earlier, I think, but feel free to speak because it was
so this is for Charlie, actually. So I mostly study subgiants rather than red giants, but one thing we're finding for subgiants is that the WKB asymptotic construction for mixed modes only really works when both the P mode and the G mode cavities are well described in the WKB limit. And so for subgiants, we're finding that in the regime of isolated avoided crossings at low G mode radial order, the WKB construction breaks down, and we need non-asymptotic methods, which we had to construct separately. And so the analogous regime for this in red giants would be that as you go far up enough the red giant branch, you start to encounter a different regime where the P modes cease to be well described in the asymptotic limit. And so by analogy, we should expect that in this regime as well, we cannot use WKB related constructions like the coupling strength Q and so forth. So what are your thoughts on this matter?
Okay, maybe I can put the video. Yes, I totally agree with you. So I agree that for the subgiant part, I agree that the gravity part is not in the asymptotic regime. And I know you wrote about that, recent works. Of course, we have to go further in the analytical description of this work. Mm-hmm. After that, I mean, all the observations we have now have been obtained by a fit of the asymptotic expression. And I know by comparison with stellar models that the asymptotic expression is not too bad to describe at leading order the frequency spectrum. So for the subgiants part, I would say, okay, we have to go further, but for now, we already have observations. For example, the coupling factor as a gravity offset. And we can already compare with just a simple analysis. For the most evolved red giant stars, so just before the luminosity, around the luminosity bump, sorry, I think. Yes, of course, we have to take the second order asymptotic expansion if you want. And so the observations take it into account, as you know. And I think there is something to do analytically and theoretically to better understand what information this curvature term can give us. Maybe it's not so. It's second order. Maybe we can get something.
Well, my concern here is that whether or not the theoretical construction works in a forward direction, it's always possible to find some value of Q that will make the modes match the WKB thing, and that may not be meaningful past a certain point. So that's my main worry here.
Yeah, sure.
So Joe, are you a theoretician? For a theoretician to admit that you can make any model fit the data.
Yes, I am.
But of course, data are made to fit the model. I mean, we have problems on both sides, and the issue of the masses is being brought up in the Slack a couple of times. On the one hand, it's in the models, mass of course is an important parameter for the star as a whole, but also the current mass and then the core mass. And the question is, to what extent can we measure them? And it may be possible in some cases. So the suggestion is, of course, if you have a binary system, maybe you can do that. And in other cases, we cannot. Are there some remarks by people about new clever ways of deriving models from observations that perhaps aren't applied as widely? Or if such ideas are a bit uncertain and are hard to calibrate, are there ways of cross-calibrating that? For instance, when you study stars in clusters or in binary systems, you may have a handle on some parameters, and then that allows you to calibrate certain methods that might be applicable to field stars, for instance, isolated stars. In a similar way that Owen mentioned, luminosity functions are useful, but of course a luminosity function you only have if you have more than one star. And if it's an individual star you're dealing with, all of a sudden you're back to this huge uncertainty, which you can only address in a sort of statistical Bayesian way. Any clever ideas of how we could move forward in maximizing what we get out for both individual stars from observations and theory, and for populations of stars in terms of observations and theory? Anyone is welcome, especially people we haven't heard at conferences much, either because they've just joined or because maybe they've often kept quiet. So it would be great to hear their ideas, untapped ideas. Well, I'll let you think about that. I think before we break, which I intend to do within the next 5 minutes or so, slightly sooner than expected, but still later than scheduled. There is all the time the issue of the convection, and it's been brought up again. But what is it that stands in the way of us understanding how to describe convection? Why don't we understand how to describe convection yet? If we do, then we should just trust what the models do with it, right? So what is it? Why is it so difficult?
I mean, I'm going to talk about this more tomorrow, but a few of the things are that, first of all, it's computationally expensive to make 3D models, and there are only handfuls of codes that can do it. The other thing in red giants and supergiants where there are only a handful of large-scale convective plumes throughout the whole star. And so 1D prescription has to capture kind of this really non-local problem, and we're making it local with something like MLT. And there is more work being done on it, and the field is progressing. And so I think that it'll be interesting to see where things stand with our understanding of convection now and years down the line.
Thanks, Jared. I don't want to cut the grass from your talk for tomorrow. We have different sessions on different topics, so we can sometimes come back to similar issues. And as it was mentioned, of course, mixing processes affect the chemical enrichment of the envelope, and perhaps to some extent also the nucleosynthesis itself. So we'll come back to that in the next session. I thought of just giving a couple of minutes if people would like to bring up something new, and then have a break and maybe come back at only 5 minutes late, sort of 1:45. So anyone would like to bring up something new that we haven't really touched on, that we're kind of trying to evade, maybe consciously or unconsciously? So Simon is being slightly controversial here on Slack, saying that internal convection is relatively, I would rephrase it, simple, but it's surface convection, which is complicated. And we might come back to that when we discuss the atmospheres and outflows later again. But if somebody would like to comment on that now, is there, what's the main difference between how to describe surface convection as compared to internal convection and overshoot? What's the fundamental difference? Or are they the same, just set in a different context?
I mean, I should have been a little bit more clear that, yeah, particularly like core convection, I think is better understood. Surface convection gets tricky because radiation is able to start escaping, and then it starts to influence things. And so we're not really in the adiabatic limit anymore, or even close to it necessarily. And if you have largely asymmetric structure or things that aren't really spherically symmetric, then the radiation processes become a lot more difficult. And so it's really important to include radiation transport into the models. And that's where everything really becomes, in my opinion, more complicated, although there are complications throughout.
Okay, thanks, Jared. Any more thoughts on that or anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
Something here?
Yes. Hello, Ben.
Hello. I think the easy part of convection is the interior of a convection zone. So if you're deep enough, the stratification is essentially adiabatic. The mixing of everything is essentially very efficient compared to everything else. So that's easy. It's all the boundaries being complicated. So this is where we have an interior overshoot. There can be mixing, entrainment, whatever. This has to be described. That happens also in the atmosphere. And there we have the additional problem that we have complex opacities, complex radiation transport. So it's, and high velocities, high Mach numbers is much more nonlinear than in the interior. So these things add, but I think the atmospheric convection is just one type of boundary convection zone, and they're all difficult. And just the atmosphere is double difficult, but we have the benefit that we can observe it directly. So we have for more than 40 years now simulations. They're improving with time. We have observations of the atmosphere, so we are pretty sure that we are good there, although there are difficulties. Now we don't have this clear observation in the interior. So having stellar structure being dependent on the interior convection doesn't help. If there are 5 convection zones with 10 boundary layers and then changing over time, how do you how do you model it? How do you try to understand it? How it works quantitatively at a given boundary? So it's just too much what we have. I mean, we know the radius of a star or something, what the observables or the surface abundances, and then it depends somehow on some boundary of the third convection zone counted from the interior or something. How do you invert this? So it's not, I think the interior is much more difficult than the surface.
So Bernd, are you saying that we do understand the fundamental physical processes, it's just difficult to put it all together into a model? Or are there still fundamental lacks in our understanding of how convection actually manifests itself?
For instance, all the simulations code, all the codes that simulate solar granulation agree on the size of the granules rather well, and that corresponds well to what we observe. But in an interior convection, what are the typical scales there? Is the large cells, the downdrafts that can be very far apart, or is it the tiny transition layer? So we don't even know the necessary resolution or what the typical scales are. And of course, the typical scales translate then immediately into overshoot depth and mixing efficiencies and kinds of things. So I have feeling we're approaching and codes improve, but we need, there are quite some steps to go. And at the surface, we're just decades better. I think, I mean, decades, there's just decades of experience, decades of comparison of models with observations. In the interior, it's much more hand-wavy. So I think, I mean, we really wait for better codes, better computers, more work has to be done. So it will come, but there's nothing, I don't think there's anything missing immediately. We just need enormously big computers and disentangle all the things in the interior to derive what's happening at the surface to get to observables. So I don't think we made a mistake or making a mistake. There's an obvious omission in the interior. It's just much more difficult.
Such a shame we can't describe it
analytically. There's open problems for decades to come. I mean, that's a good thing.
Yeah, so so there's some suggestions that perhaps lower mass stars are easier to model than high mass stars. Maybe there are just different complications in both cases. But the issue of the magnetic fields brought up. I mean, eventually we all know when you keep talking, the magnetic fields will have to form part of this discussion. So maybe to end with that, so Zsolt Castelli, do you want to just unmute and say something, or?
Yes, hi everyone. Yes, so basically my remark is just in the context that magnetic fields are perhaps most studied in the aspect of removing angular momentum from the core, but in the...
Ça va, petite madame? Oui, d'accord.
Yeah, so basically in the context of core magnetic fields, the aspect that we will look at is how they can remove angular momentum. But in recent years, there have been many interesting discoveries in terms of surface magnetic fields. And it seems that there are two kinds of magnetism that take place. And so the transition from OB stars to red supergiants would be particularly interesting to be understood.
Yes, that's true. And you suggest that especially maybe for the more massive stars where magnetic fields have been measured both on surfaces of the red supergiants progenitors as well as in outflows, for instance, of red supergiants. And so maybe that's where we can get quite a lot of information, at least for the red supergiants. And probably for low mass or giant stars, it must be possible to also measure magnetic fields systematically, but maybe I'm wrong. In thinking about the time, so we have been actually discussing almost half an hour as we initially envisaged, and we of course never thought that we would only need half an hour. So what we'll do is we will take a 10-minute break. It's important to take a break on these digital meetings in particular. So we will keep the meeting open. So you can just you can stay on the meeting, or you can leave and join the same meeting again. This meeting will not end in itself. So we will resume in 10 minutes. So that's 10 minutes to 3 UT. And thanks everybody for joining and contributing, I should have said.
Yes, thank you. And